Welcome to the Hilaritas Press podcast, where we explore the vast world of Robert Anton Wilson. Mike Gathers here, checking in with researcher, author, teacher, and consultant, Dr. James Fadiman. Richard Alpert first turned Jim onto psilocybin in 1961. Jim soon moved to Perry Lane, the Stanford Bohemian Quadrant, which was ground zero for Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. There in Menlo Park, Jim guided Stuart Brand on his first LSD experience. He went on to help found the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology and continues to teach to this day. Jim wrote the Psychedelic Explorers Guide Safe, Therapeutic, and Sacred Journeys in 2011 and has co-written with his friend Jordan Gruber 2 books, Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Advanced Performance, and Your Symphony of Selves, Discover and Understand More of Who We Are. And so, right here, right now, it is my great pleasure to share with you my chat with Jim Fadiman.
I was just thinking, why do I like podcasts and I don't like presentations? And
Ooh.
I thought, I never learn anything when I do a presentation.
Mm.
But your questions either are things that interest you and not me, that interest both, or that interest both of us. But in any case, it's live, and I have to be, and I notice myself needing to think, which is a great gift.
Well, excellent. That my intention is I listen to a lot of your previous podcasts and try to think of like maybe what would the next question be.
Terrific.
So we'll see how this goes. Sounds like it'll be fun. Well, I'll just go ahead and get started. Jim Fadiman, welcome to Hilaritas Press Podcast.
Thank you.
I'll have to put a lengthy introduction into the preview because there's a lot that you've been through. But one of the things that really caught my attention is that you co-founded the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology.
Right.
And I went to Naropa University to get my transpersonal counseling psychology or psychotherapy degree back in the late aughts.
Terrific.
Yeah, and we talked a lot about CIIS, the California Institute of Integral Studies, which is kind of like a sister institution, perhaps. But I had heard of ITP, but I don't know much about it. But I guess my first question is, how would you define transpersonal psychology?
Well, transpersonal psychology is psychology of the human condition.
Hmm.
If you think of kind of a bell curve of most everything like height, weight, and so forth, you also have a bell curve of human experience. And psychology has done a lot on one end, which is from normal to pathology.
Ah.
But humanity has done a lot more with from normal up. And so when you add in the rest of human experience, then you get to suddenly, instead of hanging out with psychopaths and people you don't like, you're hanging out with geniuses and mystics and culture changers. And so what we were looking at is the only way we thought you can understand human beings is to look at all of them. And that psychology, in a sense, made a kind of decision, which is spiritual and religious can't be mapped over to look like hard science. So let's just not look at it. Parapsychology is against our theory. And are we going to, if we have a choice between theory and experience, a lot of people say, well, I want theory. And we all said that makes no sense at all. So we were simply looking at the whole being. And we found to our amazement that students appeared and said yes, because we really had we began with no curriculum.
Mm.
And we said to the students who had showed up from around the country and were a little nervous, what do you want to learn?
Wow.
And that was a fascinating and as you can imagine, for conventional students, a very difficult question. And then we said, what faculty that you know of might you want to teach you this? And some of them knew some of them, and we knew some of them. And so we invited some of the people we knew to develop courses around student need. And that's how the curriculum started to develop.
Wow. I'm actually kind of stunned here. I mean, that seems very courageous. You just kind of dove in without a plan, so to speak, and it just manifested on its own.
Well, some years later, Bob Frazier, who was really the founder, and I were sitting on a hillside and thinking, well, the school's gotten to be almost conventional. What would we develop now? And we came
Mm.
up with some ideas of a very interesting school. And then we both looked at each other and said, we know too much about how to make a school. We would never do it again.
Mm.
And transpersonal, because it makes common sense, um, is much more widely, thought about. It's not necessarily called transpersonal, uh, but it simply makes sense if you're looking at anything. If you're looking at a species of bacteria, you want to find out what the range is, not half the range.
Right.
So,
That's
so transpersonal has continued to expand well beyond its definition.
that's I love the simplicity of that definition. I've never heard it put that way, but it's like normal psychology studying kind of a little bit of the median and the peak of the bell curve, if you want to call it that, and all the way out to the psychopathology. But now you're covering kind of like the high performance versus low functioning. Is that fair?
That's very fair. Yeah, and of course, high functioning is also where the changes are happening. Where the growth is happening. What is it? I mean, for instance, we have a whole group of people who are super smart. They're called high functioning. Now they're called high functioning autism. Okay, but we know they're intellectually high functioning, and they are. And they have some other things. They also have a certain weakness and inability to see normal social emotional cues. But if you're not studying the high end, you don't, if you're only studying their pathology, you miss everything that's important about them.
That's so what resonates with me right now is we hear a lot, or I hear a lot about neurodivergent,
Right.
and and they it seems like there's an emphasis on not pathologizing it so much, but looking at what it brings to the table, or what the various ways that neurodivergence manifests in a more positive light. Like, what are the advantages?
Had we had that term years ago, we would have instantly applied it to part of our curriculum.
Oh, wow. Yeah, right.
Because neurodivergent also says there's a normal. Now that's an assumption, okay? That a lot of people are, if we look at weight, is there a normal? Well, yes, but is it in the middle? Not particularly, say, in the United States, where we have a huge percentage of obese people. So if we just measure and take that middle place, we miss what's going on.
Hmm.
So neurodivergent suggests there's a non-divergent place, and I'm not sure about that.
Right. It's a tricky term.
But at least it's going in the right direction of saying differences are of interest.
No, perfect. Exactly. Huh. Well, that's a whole different perspective on transpersonal. I'm really appreciating it. At Norpa, we would say trans means across and beyond. So transpersonal means across the personal and beyond the personal.
That's really the way we originally had it, which is beyond the personality. And that was coming out of mystical, that was coming out of really conventional, I mean, everybody's mysticism from whatever tradition you are, because the mystics are talking about real experiences. And the real experience of going beyond one's personality or one's ego or one's identity um, is what focused us originally. When Bob Fraser and I were putting together a school, you can't simply look only again at that far end. So we defined what the school was, looking at everything.
Mm. And so if I understood you correctly, the idea behind the university is that we want to just like we talked about defining transpersonal, look at like the upper end of maybe higher performing, higher functioning.
Well,
eh,
we spent more time there because that's where it's most interesting, and where conventional psychology was afraid to go.
ah,
So we had a certain nah, doing something you're not. I mean, Bob was a graduate of Berkeley and taught at Santa Cruz. I was a Stanford graduate. So and I was a Harvard undergraduate. So we figured we got the conventional. We got the kind of A group of what you're supposed to know and supposed to learn. And then when we looked at our own lives and our inner lives and the lives of our teachers, we saw there was a whole nother level that had been left out. And then we began to realize that psychology didn't leave it out by mistake. They left it out on purpose.
you used the word afraid earlier. Is there what you say more about that?
Well, psychology um, is used, and I put quotes around it, a social science, which means it's kind of like a real science.
Right.
And somebody wonderful many years ago said, you looked around the campus and you saw who got all the new buildings, who got all the fun. Oh, that's the new chemistry building. That's the new physics building. That's the biology building. What's that over there near the old library? Oh, that's psychology. And so the psychologists looking across the campus thought, I'd rather be with the big kids. And so you begin to have psychological science and you begin to have
Right.
statistics and you begin to have double blind research, which has nothing, which is about psychopharmacology. And you began to then say, well, what about these mystics? Well, they can't be put into the science part of the curriculum. So why don't we just leave them out? Because when the science people come over and say, we've just heard you're doing some parapsychology experiments and you're a bunch of cuckoos, that makes it less likely we're going to get across campus and get our building. So it was let us say the academic world isn't academic. It's a busy capitalistic system where people are trying to get more space and more for grants and
Sure.
so on, like everybody else. So um, psychology doesn't ever hasn't made it to be if you talk to real scientists and you say, what do you think of psychology? And there's usually not a sneer, but a kind of, yeah, what do I think of, what do I think of opera?
Opera and ballet.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with those, but they're not science.
And part of what I'm hearing is that when you start looking at this opposite side of the spectrum, you start getting into spiritual and mystical experience, and that in the academic crowd kind of detracts, is a little woo, takes away from your legitimacy.
Right. And who made up those rules?
Right.
Which is they did.
Right.
So what we were looking at is when you start with experience and you start with there's basically positive and not so positive experiences. And then you begin to say, well, I want to study those, but I end up finding that the positive experiences are they taste better. They're more interesting. And we were in an era where you begin to have genuine access to mystical states through psychedelics. So all of a sudden, you weren't looking at whatever Buddha might have said, because the first writings we have of the Buddha were written down 500 years after Buddha's death. So and if you press Buddhists on, they say, well, people memorize stuff. And if you ever play the game of telephone,
Right.
the chances of pure memorization good for 500 years is a low bar, not likely. So we were again, but there were contemporary Buddhists who could speak directly to the same area of experience that the Buddha experienced. So we now can do a lot of what science is comfortable with because we can measure all kinds of things, but we're still so transpersonal. So transpersonal was considered dangerous for psychology.
Hmm.
I remember when we were turned down for being part of some major psychological system and for our curriculum, and they had visited us and so forth, and they said your dissertations are incredibly high level, and they said a lot of good things. And when we were turned down, you read this 10-page document, and all of a sudden there's two paragraphs, and you could tell they were written by lawyers because they couldn't say, we turned you down because we didn't like you.
Right. Okay.
So we were turned down for some reason. And what they were saying is, your curriculum is disturbing to our higher ambitions, which are to be more and more acceptable and realistically a part of hard science. And my feeling at the time was terrific. That's fair. We agree.
We're on the right track.
Yeah, it's kind of, if you would, since you have the kind of club that we don't want to be invited to. And transpersonal has continued to be more and more within the culture, as altered states are more and more within the culture. But again, if you look at a psychology curriculum, it looks a lot like it has looked, except for a lot more statistics and a lot more hard-nosed studies. And I'm reminded when I first had kids, I called up my friend Charlie Tart, who was a great psychologist, a super cool researcher, and very interested in parapsychology. And I said to Charlie, I now have kids. What psychology book about children, because I know you teach child, can I get? He said, none of them.
Right.
He said, there are no psychology books of the textbooky world that are useful in raising children. And I was actually startled.
Mm.
But what he was saying is that isn't what they're doing. And there is, of course, a beautiful, huge literature by parents usually on good ways to work with children. So psychology. Psychology is kind of like when you're at the high school dance and there's someone over in the corner who isn't popular,
That's the
and
the
they
psych.
and they don't like to, and they're trying to look like they're not sad. So I am a retired member of the American Psychological Association, and I actually published somewhere in the psychology, in that journal, but it was a criticism of somebody. And psychology serves obviously a lot of good purposes, but it used to be the most popular major in colleges.
Hmm.
Then economics became the most popular, and now computer science is the most popular. So you can see the way the knowledge business has shifted from what's called a classical education, which meant literature, philosophy, art, uh, metaphysics, and science, in a direction more towards science and less towards that. So that let us say, if we wanted to say, how many classics departments have started up in the last 20 years in colleges, my guess would be zero. So we're seeing a shift in the culture, and we just have to be careful that we don't lose what the reasoning behind classical education was. And the transpersonal was, in a sense, psychology, a psychologist's way of dealing with how can I get to read all these really wonderful and important books and discover these important ways of living and still be in psychology.
Um, do you have a recommendation along those lines? Like, we get in the realm of transpersonal psychology, there's so many directions it could go. Um, and I guess what I'm thinking is that you wrote, or maybe wrote an introduction to a re-release of a Maslow book or something like that.
Bob Fraser and I were asked by the publisher to do a second edition of Maslow's book on motivation.
Right.
And what it was Maslow's defense of psychology against psychoanalysis.
Oh,
Psychoanalysis by that time um, had become a very small part of everything. So what we mainly did, and we really had a couple of super smart graduate students really do most of the work, is Maslow had extensive footnotes where he would say, what I just said, and here you guys, it's wrong here, wrong here, wrong here, wrong here, mentioning, names and so forth. Basically, we took away all the footnotes. And Maslow's essential argument is very compelling because it's about the full human being, and it's widely cited. Um, there are academia is a place that kind of trolls the world and finds names. And so we often will find that it has been cited in all kinds of things. Someone is doing um, a study on migrant children in Botswana, and there'll be a citation to Maslow.
hmm.
Someone is doing a study on different marketing techniques for Norwegian products, and we'll have a citation to Maslow. So it's looked upon as a good book to introduce you to a way of looking at human beings. So our our edition has almost nothing of us, has a lot of work from our graduate students, and so forth.
And then I don't know if you can see this. Scott Barry Kaufman came out with kind of a rehash of Maslow a few years ago.
Good rehash.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um,
yeah, Maslow was a humanist. He was not a transpersonalist.
right.
Um, Transpersonal made him, he was a little concerned um, that we were, again, Maslow came out of hard science. His undergraduate or graduate work, I guess, was with monkeys, where he did some of that research where you have a monkey and it has and you have a little doll that's a monkey looking that's soft, and you have another little doll that's monkey looking that has very hard fabric. And you find out that monkeys, watch out, ready, prefers more mother-like, soft, friendly things. Okay, that's his graduate work. So he came
Oh, wow. Yeah.
out of a very strange part of science, etc., moving towards the transpersonal. And he made way more intellectual jumps and risks than any of us. So we came along and said, that's terrific, Abe. You're right. And there's this whole other area that you still haven't looked at. And he, in essence, said, I can't handle all of that. So
Seem-
he kind of puts his toes into the transpersonal, and it's clear that it fits with everything he's been saying. Um, but he wasn't. It made him nervous.
Gotcha.
And I recall we were taking a flight together. He and I were sitting quietly, and and he mentioned that he was putting a footnote into a new edition of one of his books that, as I remember, I think it was suggesting that things like the tarot cards and the I Ching were cuckoo. And I said to Abe, I wouldn't do that if I were you. I'm this very young person. He's this very senior person. Um, and he said, why? And I explained, and he said, okay. Says, it is not well known, but I was hired to teach at Brandeis in Maslow's position when he had a Ford Foundation grant for a year off. And,
Oh,
and he suggested me to the department, and they
well,
all said no. And then he said, it's my position and it's my month off, and Fadiman is my choice. Write him a nice letter. So all I knew in California is I had a very nice letter from the faculty saying, you're very welcome. And I was welcome as a person, and they were nice people, and we got along. Uh, but it was clear that Maslow, who had created the department, had created it, what he felt was balancing it to the right and left of him. And then ahead of the department was one of the people on the right, and the whole department had moved towards conventional psychology over the years. So I had a wonderful year at Brandeis, loved my students. The faculty and I dealt with each other, um, and life went on.
cool. I mean, well, did did you ever explore or have any thoughts on the Eighth Circuit model of consciousness with Leary and Wilson put out there? Is that
I have a very low tolerance for theory
perfect?
because there's another term for theory which is guessed.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And science says there are whole parts of science that says you're not allowed to do certain things until you have theory. The federal government says about pharmaceuticals, until you have a mechanism, which is theory, which is how does it work, it's really hard for us to allow you to sell it. The fact that it works, that's fine. But if you don't understand how it works, that's not fine. So theory is its own kind of religious place. And due to some psychedelic experiences that made it clear to me that theory was not my path. So I like theorists, but I'm not. Once you say a theory is a guess, it immediately relaxes you.
Yeah, you don't have to get so caught up in the seriousness of it.
Terrible part of a theory is if you have one, at that moment you start to defend it.
And then you
And
try to shape all your ideas around it and
yeah, I was looking at it's a theory I think in physics, but it had a very it had one person who loved it, who was the inventor of it and respected. And over the years, he just got more and more defensive as evidence came in that it wasn't like most theories, it was incomplete or inaccurate or so forth. So I try to be as little of a crank as possible. And one way to limit that is to not have heavy theories.
theory free.
Yeah, so actually, there is a study going on in London where they're asking a number of psychoanalysts to theorize on the how psychedelics work as for therapy under that theoretical umbrella. And I'm thinking, I don't even it makes very little sense to me to pretend that this theory is going to be very useful. But for the people whose lives are linked with it, they're like theologians of their own world. I'm very curious what they'll come up with.
Your sound cut out and you did you
So,
say something?
did I say something?
Okay, there you go. I lost you for a second on Zoom, but
Probably it was something that needs not to be recorded.
There you go.
That's my theory.
Well, I appreciate that because I've heard you speak that about microdosing, and there's all this talk about neuroplasticity and default mode network and serotonin and neurotransmitters, and I find it refreshing when I hear a real neuroscientist say, well, we really don't know what the heck's going on. Um,
Well, let's take, there is a theory, and it's been out there for years, that psychedelics affect a particular neuron in a particular way. Now, common sense says here is something which goes to every cell of the body. Why would it only affect one kind of neuron in the brain? So someone actually, but it does, and that you can measure something, and when scientists find something to measure, they flock to it, kind of like bees to a sweet flower, and they forget all the less sweet flowers nearby. So somebody at one point with a lot better equipment and more money and science moving said, well, why don't we just measure like 35 different kinds of neurons with a psychedelic? Oh, it affects 33 of them. Oh, that's that's much more like common sense.
and that's complex, hard to wrap a theory around.
It says you have to come out with a whole different kind of theories, and you don't get to kind of say, got it, got this one neuron. I think if you're fishing and you get a fish, there are two things you can do. You can say, this is a fish of this species. Or you can say, that's what's in the ocean right here is those fish. That's true too. And if you don't say, of course, I have no idea about all the other fish that are there too, then you're no longer in the realm of theory. You're just saying what seems to be obvious. But there's something in science. I read a beautiful scientist recently who was asked, what makes you happiest? And she said, when a piece of information suddenly fits another piece of information and we have new understanding.
Hmm.
I thought, yes. She didn't say, and it validates my theory. So she doesn't have theory, she just has science.
Right. And it's so, like you've been saying all along, just once you create the theory, it becomes like a attractor point to where everything starts wrapping around that theory in your mind.
And we call theories often by the name of the defender. There's Freudian theory, there's Adlerian theory, there's Maslowian theory, there's Skinnerian theory. Um, Wait a moment. No, there isn't.
Hmm. Well, let's switch gears maybe to macrodosing since we touched on it. You have a wonderful quote. It's not how much you take, it's how much you're willing to let go of.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
I like that. I have no idea when I said it, but that's terrific.
I caught that off of some podcast and it was like hit me like a ton of bricks.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting because when you're working with someone who's on a macrodose and they're in a safe place and they're lying on a couch and they've got headphones on and they get upset about something, um, you let them say, that's fine. So here's a very classic worry. I think I'm dying. And that you should,
Mm,
but and kind of they know, they say, I feel like I'm dying.
mm,
What you don't say, oh no, 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 you're not dying, you're fine. You say, that's great. And then you hold their hand so they have awareness that they're safe. And they then find out that what felt like dying going in was actually probably theory. Um, their identity, their ego identity, being uh, noticing that you now notice there's more to them than that.
Mm.
Ego is about to lose its primacy, and it tries every game in the book. And because once you get through that place, which felt like death, what people now say is, oh, 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 as
Mm.
they become aware that um, they're capable of experiencing well beyond their personality. And that's quite a revelation.
How much would you, so the I think the book is the Psychedelic Explorers Guide or Handbook,
Guide.
and the subtitle is Safe, Therapeutic, and Sacred,
Right.
which is kind of what we just touched on right there. Um, what do I want to say? I was listening to Zach Leary talk about where we're at with psychedelics today and where we're going. And one thing that struck me is that there's so much emphasis on the therapeutic side that we've kind of lost touch with the fun.
Lost touch with the fun and to large extent, if you're looking at the literature, the spiritual,
Right,
beyond ego. And if I can just coin a term, the transpersonal, trans through the personal.
right.
Why is that? Um, because there's a business side to psychedelics.
Mm,
There's an enormous need for ways to help people become less mentally disturbed and physically ill. And there's not a big market for making people more compassionate and loving and spiritual. It's just a different
mm,
market. And this same wonderful woman I just quoted was saying her concern is that the the need for making money will put on a sideline cures and substances and ways which are very inexpensive and not profitable. Uh, which eventually, when we get to it in this interview, will be a definition of microdosing. Okay.
perfect.
We haven't gotten there yet. And um, Zach is 100% right, which is it's kind of like, um, I go to Paris and I say I've explored the whole city, and then I write 25 pages on eating. Now, one can easily do that in Paris and that's a wonderful way of describing the incredible amount of fine and food, etc. But it's not a very good description of Paris. It's a description of the part of it that, in this case, it appeals to people who have an economic or gastronomic interest in food. And obviously, if I said, well, he did another one on museums and he did another one on architecture and so forth, we begin to get a fuller picture. But what Zach is saying, that when you are in a capitalist system, it rewards things that bring in more that are profitable. And the problem that the psychedelic therapy world is now grappling with is the way they've designed it is too expensive.
Yeah.
So that the people in Oregon have to charge quite a lot given the number of people and space and so forth that it takes. And most of the groups in Oregon, where it's very legal to help people, have gone under for economic reasons. There was just too much overhead and people not willing to pay a high amount.
So yeah, there's this path to commercialization, um, and because of that, the emphasis is on safe and therapeutic. It sounds like the spiritual gets left, kind of like what we were talking about with transpersonal psychology earlier, and then it's um, too woo for the commercialization. And then when you just, how does the fun factor in? I guess is.
Well, the fun factor is when you're taking it in a situation where the dose is low enough so that you're also safe, or you're in a situation where it's safe enough to take a high dose, and you're there to enjoy the pleasures of your mind. You're enjoying the kind of the panorama, so that when you look at a tree and the tree then you see looks back at you and smiles,
Mm.
and then you say to the tree, are you smiling at me? And the tree says, I'm always smiling. Okay. And then you say to yourself, oh my, I'm pretty high. Okay. But you also are aware that the tree is a living being, it has a personality, and it can somehow reach across the barriers that you, as a human being, always have set up because you've taken down those fences. So that the pleasure, um, well, as I said, I've sat in a lot of therapeutic settings, and there's a place during the day when people start laughing. And very often the laughter is at who they thought they were.
Ooh.
And so they're in a sense saying, "Oh my, I was certainly um, caught with my view of the world, and it's as if I was um, in a very small room with thick walls, and I'm now seeing the psychedelic taking the walls down, and I realized that my little room was in this beautiful valley with this ocean. And then I realized that this valley and ocean were actually one substance called, we would call them, molecules, and that they're all running together, and that I'm actually not looking at them, but I'm feeling as if I am part of them. And then I realize with my little sciencey mind, of course, um, I was I think I was writing something the other day that says the notion that we're connected to all things is disturbingly obvious. It's as if otherwise, I've got all these air molecules, okay, all over, and I'm taking them in and taking them out. And also, if we measure, there's all kinds of other things coming in and out. Obviously, I'm connected, but I don't act that way. And I have a culture that doesn't act that way.
Mm.
When I'm in a situation where I can allow the interconnection in, the general overall feeling, if you're asking people, how do you best describe the beyond place that psychedelics allow you to see and experience, they say the universe seems to be made of love.
Mm.
Comes again out of all the great traditions and all of a huge number of psychedelic explorers, because that seems to be the best way to describe it. And you say, is that what it really is? And they say, no, of course it's not like that. But that's as close as I can get because it feels as if the universe is positive in some way. It's not against, and it doesn't set up barriers. And then you begin to get, what do we define love as? And it gets close. So what Zach is saying, if you miss all that, um, what'd you do when you went to the circus? I had five boxes of popcorn in the parking lot, and that was fantastic popcorn. Well, wait a moment, you missed most of it. You say, well, I had a good time. You say, but there's a whole larger world that you would have had not a good time, but you would have laughed at that you thought being in the parking lot with parking popcorn was much.
Right.
So that laughter is it's when you're working with people, that's a very good guide to where they are.
Right. It's sort of what hits me is like just kind of coming to realization of the absurdity of the whole situation in a way.
Yeah. Well, not well. The absurdity is that you bought into it.
Right. There you go.
This
Yeah.
is just another situation. I mean, the tree says, being tied down isn't necessarily the best possible way to live, but since I am tied down, I get the most out of it I can. And since we're human, um, and we see what you begin to notice if you start just reading mystics. There was a wonderful article in the Journal of Transpersonal very early on, and it was quotes from mystics and quotes from theoretical physicists,
Right.
who, as the reader, were supposed to guess which was.
Mm.
And I did terribly on that test. And I thought, oh, that's why. And then the author said, of course you did, because theoretical physics, which gets beyond the definitions of which no longer thinks that a molecule is limiting, it's just part of a system. And you come out from physicists with the same awarenesses, the same way of describing the universe as mystics do from coming in.
Wow. It's that just listening to you talk, it's that kind of experiential perspective that you like to bring versus the theory. I'm just kind of summarizing, but it's more and more apparent as you talk about how you're speaking from experience rather than theory.
as,
Uh,
as often as I can.
as often as humanly allowable. Um, well, maybe before we move on from macrodosing, do you want to touch on the risk-benefit ratio?
Oh yeah, that's my one of my favorite terms. Risk benefit ratio is basically what's the possible danger and what are the possible benefits. And if we look at high doses, it's a there's a real risk, which is why we have guides and why we have special rooms and why we have training and why we have integration, because you can, when you first get out from outside your mind, your personality, your theory of life, for some people that's terrifying. For some people it's delightful. But in any case, when you come back and you look at other people and you get that they have no idea what you've experienced, that's disorienting. So we have a whole system to protect people from the risks. And the rewards are both mental health and more. So if we move to microdosing, the risk reward ratio, the risk goes
Mm,
way down because there's almost no physical changes, and the mental changes are very small. And the benefits, say for depression, let's say you're a someone who has a term that I find uncomfortable, treatment resistant depression. I find it uncomfortable because it kind of suggests it's your fault.
right.
Okay? What it's really saying is whatever we had didn't work for you. And you get people who have, I'm thinking of like Waldman's book about a really good day, and she lists about 20 medications that worked and didn't work for her over the years. Okay. And then you get to the with microdosing, the depression seems to lift. And what people say after 2 or 3 microdoses, I'm back. What
Mm,
I'm I feel the way I felt before I got depressed. And that happens often enough so that you can say it's a realistic choice to microdose for depression because the risks of the microdose are very small. And the rewards, certainly in this case, are much larger. So it's a risk reward ratio. And when you get to some of the kind of more remarkable conditions, the risk reward ratio is even better. So I feel comfortable when someone says, I have such and such and such and such. Do you think microdosing would help? And if it's something I don't know anything about, I will say, I have no idea. But the risk reward ratio is pretty good.
mm,
You're, if you microdose correctly within the right dose range, and if you go a little low, no effect. And if you go a little higher, you begin to feel a little high. And that says you've made it, it is no longer microdosing, it's no longer working. And that's really important because
yeah.
most of the people in even the psychedelic world and in the pharmaceutical world are clear that if you take more of something, you get more of the effect. Take one aspirin, you get so much for your part. Two aspirin, you get more effect. You get 10 aspirin, you get way more effect, and you get internal bleeding. So the risk reward kind of.
Oops.
So so what we're seeing is um, that again the shifts that microdosing seems to have are relatively safe, and and yes, um, one of the things that generally isn't known is we have, say, and I'm under giving you a lower number, 40 million people in the United States have taken psychedelics since they became illegal. How many people have died just of taking a psychedelic?
Mm,
None.
okay.
Okay. How many people have died of aspirin? Many, 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 many.
I
How
haven't, yeah.
many died of peanut butter? About 100 a year from allergic reactions. Okay. Um, so the psychedelics, high doses even, are among the safest things that we know how to take. Microdoses are even way safer than that. So it, given that you're talking about something that's relatively safe and statistically known to be safe, it allows people a little more freedom in should they look into it more. That's kind of the first thing you ask of anything is it going to hurt me?
Right.
If I'm taking a weight loss drug, it's pretty clear that I'm going to lose weight. What are the side effects? Okay, and we're now, of course, finding that there's a lot of side effects, and and for many people, the loss of weight is better than it's worth the side effects. So psychedelics have a different pattern of side effects.
I guess I want to also emphasize is the framework you're using for microdosing is that um, you really shouldn't feel any psychedelic effects
Right.
from the chemical.
No psychedelic effects. Now, some jerk very early on called it subperceptual. Now, I'm the jerk, so I that sounds like you have no effect. What I was trying to find is a word that says you don't have any psychedelic effects. So there are another number of terms. The one I'm now using is subthreshold. And for people who've used psychedelics, they know what I mean.
Yeah.
Um, so that so that microdosing has um, tiny. You know when you've microdosed. People say I look forward to a microdosing day, predominantly because whatever else is going on, people almost always report improved mood.
Mm.
So if I'm taking it for chronic pain, my pain may be the same level, but I will be slightly detached from it. So instead of I'm in pain, is my leg is in pain. And that turns out to be a huge psychological shift that's beneficial. Now, remember, the pain has not improved. Very often, the other way people report on pain is it does improve the pain. My pain, which was an 8, is now a 7. So, so microdosing initially is very puzzling because it seemed to kind of have effects all over the place. If we now begin to not theorize, but generalize, it looks like the system works better when it's on a microdose.
Mm.
It means if you have a migraine headache, it gets to be less. If you have a, a painful ankle, it begins to be less. If you're working on a coding problem, your skill doesn't get more, but your ability to stay in your highest focus self is longer. So we're talking about a range of things, all of which say, um, I feel more effective when I feel better. And if here's something that makes me feel better, and I'm focusing on a particular issue, um, then microdosing is what's going on.
It's something very subtle. And the word that keeps coming to my mind is like lube for the system, for the psyche.
Yeah, yeah. When it's when you when you take your car in for a tune-up and you get back the little bill and they've replaced a certain amount of oil and so and no parts, no new parts. Okay. But the car runs better because they have tweaked a whole lot of little parts so that the whole car runs better.
Hmm.
And that little tweaking seems to be what microdosing does. It seems to put back into equilibrium things that are in disequilibrium.
Right. And it seems, as you, I think, have stated, it kind of knows where to go. It finds the spot.
Well, it goes everywhere. Um, I guess, if you have someone come in and clean your house, you don't tell them which places to go to because they've been to a lot of houses. And they kind of clean all those spaces, some of which are actually, say, very dirty, and some have a little bit of dust on them. But they make the whole, and when they go away, the whole house, it feels better. So a microdose doesn't know where to go, but it is particularly sensitive to things that aren't working. Just as when here's my hand, and if I cut my hand, a whole lot of cells, a whole lot of part of my brain says, "Oh my God, he just cut his hand, it's bleeding. Let's send the kind of cells that are particularly helpful to stopping the bleeding. Oh, let's also send certain kinds of cells which prevent infection, and so forth and so on." So a whole lot of very specialized cells suddenly appear here, and the wound closes, a scab closes, so forth and so on. How did the brain know where to go? It noticed when there was a disequilibrium.
Gotcha.
So microdosing perhaps is disequilibrium um, seeking.
It almost like it, yeah, restores equilibrium and yeah. I want to say at some point I heard you mention that you were starting to study the indigenous peoples, microdosing with the
Yeah.
indigenous cultures. Have you learned anything from that?
Well, I had to really out of embarrassment because when I was doing the early few years of finding out about microdosing and listening to hundreds of people, um, it didn't occur to me that there was like 9,000 years of prior research. And at one point, I was feeling, hey, Jim Fadiman is really terrific. He has discovered this use of psychedelics. And I had a very kind anthropologist friend, and he said, "Did you ever think that people who've used these for hundreds of years would have tried low doses?" I thought, oh. So if you say go to, say, the beach week, because ibogaine is kind of the drug of choice these days, how do you use ibogaine? Well, we have a 3 day um, introduction to adulthood in which you're taking ibogaine a lot. You're in incredible visionary spaces. You have dancers around you. You have your relatives. It's an incredible scene where you come into adulthood, and high importance is absolute communication with your own ancestors.
Hmm.
And then a friend of mine, Lucy Walker, who's a filmmaker, said when she was in the Beach, she said, "Do you use it for anything else?" And they said, "Oh yeah, what do you use it for?" "Well, hunting."
Hmm.
"How do you use it?" "Well, you take a little dose and it increases visual acuity and it increases your endurance, which for hunters is like you can't ask for anything,
Jackpot.
other than maybe better shoes." And then she said, "Well, you use it for anything else?" He said, "Well, yeah, it's pretty good for sex too." Okay, so what we're looking at is here's an indigenous culture or a culture that's older than ours and not, and indigenous means it is where it is. And they use
Hmm.
a very high dose way with a ritual, and it's a huge deal. And they also use it as a microdose where it's sensible. And so, other friends who've worked with the Mazatec, you use it for colds when people are having a little bit of trouble during pregnancy. So what we found is that the indigenous people were doing exactly what we were doing, was trying it out in a low dose, and it was appropriate for a whole nother range of things. They also had high dose use, which was a ritual and was structured and was a very important part of their culture, which in the 60s, when the psychedelic culture was developing, was similar. So that raves, for example, were
Sure.
use of a particular substance. And it was a very good use of that substance for that kind of event. So yes, I have not been studying the indigenous, but I have been um, made aware that by trying to add in what the indigenous people are doing, you just have a whole lot of knowledge that we don't. And there's a group in Peru called micro ayahuasca. And they're a bunch of young people with psychological training, and they're clinicians and they train people. But the medicine, I'm speaking the way they speak, the medicine we have made for every an individual, the individual works directly with the Shipibo shaman. The shaman prepares the medicine for that person. And we work together because the Shipibo medicine man has had 20 to 40 years of working with a lot of different plants for different purposes for different people.
It's like a whole realm of study that's been completely overlooked.
Well, it's overlooked because in the Western world, one is indigenous people don't know stuff because they don't publish. And two is most of the people who visit indigenous people aren't ethnobotanists,
Right.
which is they're not really attuned to the use of plants. And again, with microdosing, if you read the anthropological literature, it almost never appears in tribes that use it a lot. Why? Because also they don't discuss how they brush their teeth. It's not a big deal, what
Just
else do your people do? Well, let's see, what do? We cook, because indigenous people are trying to always figure out what are anthropologists here for? What do they want? And what makes them excited? Okay. And we all know that if we talk about our sexual practices, they're fascinated. But if we talk about how we the 32 different ways we use maize, most of them lose interest. If this one guy over here turns to, he's a maize specialist. That's what he does. So I'm trying to think, there aren't very many places where people have made shifts in how they're working with microdosing based on indigenous work, because most
right.
indigenous work is really more indigenous, more correct for that culture.
Right. It works for them and where they're at.
Yeah. I mean, the people who use mescaline um, don't use it in the way that the Native Americans use it, that don't have a teepee and don't have a meeting and don't have there's a whole set of rituals how you get the best benefits for the tribal unit and the individual. When you do peyote, it's either a group wanting it or they're working to help one individual.
Gotcha.
So there's a whole nother world of how one can work with psychedelics that the macro psychedelic people have I think, pretty much they've benefited from, but they haven't adopted much.
Fascinating. Well, we're at the end of our time here. Covered about 30% of my questions, but that was wonderful. Anything in closing you'd like to say about microdosing or anything else?
Um, this is a info commercial. There are 10 million people, according to the RAND Corporation, who microdosed last year in the United States.
Wow.
Most of them did not have too much information. That's why this book exists. It has more information than you need. It also has about 35 conditions, of which we've touched on two or three. And that's what it was for. It's not a reading book. It's a looking into for what you're personally interested in book. Um,
Gotcha.
and and we'll be having Spanish and Portuguese editions by next year. The Spanish editions will be again available in the States. Um, and there's a lot of information for microdosing out there. I recommend if you're interested in microdosing, Google something, Google a psychedelic group near you. Um, yes, it's possible to make mistakes with microdosing. It's hard, but people have achieved it. Don't be one of them. And it's been wonderful talking to you. And we should, if we really only got 30%, then we're going to have to make another date next quarter and pick up another 30%.
Sounds lovely. And I want to just close with kind of paraphrasing your words, but with microdosing, you're changing the world by making people nicer.
It's Paul Stamets. And
Oh,
yes,
perfect. Well, Jim, thank you so much for your time. It's been a joy, and maybe we'll catch you again in a few more months.
terrific. Thank you so much. And I love the background in your your views.
This is Jim's art, by the way, his photo.
Okay, thanks again.
Thank you. All right, Jim, take care. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you to Jim for taking the time to chat. Thank you, as always, to the Robert Anton Wilson Trust and to Richard Rasa of Hilaritas Press for editing and production. This is Mike Gathers signing off with love and cheerfulness. Amor et Hilaritas.